snap. The kick is in the air, and the kick this time is no, sir-ree. No, sir-ree. Final score, Tennessee 20, Florida 17. Pandemonium reigns.
You're listening to the RTI Podcast, powered by RockyTopInsider.com.
Hello there, everyone, and welcome in to another episode of the RTI Podcast. I am Nathaniel Rutherford, the managing editor of RockyTopInsider.com, and I am joined by Ben McKee, our staff writer at RTI, and he's also the co-host and producer of the Swain Event Morning Radio Show. We appreciate all of you for tuning in to this episode. If it's your first time listening, thank you so much. You can subscribe to us in Apple Podcast if you have an Apple product. If you have an Android device, you can find us in whatever podcaster app you use there to search Rocky Top Insider. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's the way a lot of you guys listen. Actually, I think maybe more of you listen that way than the traditional podcast way at this point. But just search Rocky Top Insider on YouTube and subscribe to us there. Or check out our website, RockyTopInsider.com. You click on the podcast tab, and all the podcasts will show up there. And you can listen to it straight from that webpage, or you can download it from there, or you can access the YouTube video from there as well. So we appreciate all of you who interact with it, all of you who leave comments and interact with us online, and we really appreciate it. We may have to do some kind of mailbag. We usually do a mailbag on the website that Ben and I answer questions from people on Twitter and stuff like that, but we may try to do a mailbag question podcast for the actual podcasts. I think that'd be interesting to answer questions from you all in an audio medium. So we'll kind of look into that, but right now, Ben, we got a lot to talk about. It's been another busy week, and it's only Tuesday for Tennessee athletics. Over the weekend, it was kind of a slow weekend, and it was nice. So I was able to kind of get a little bit of a break after, of course, we covered the Tennessee-Kentucky game Sunday. There wasn't a whole lot going on because we're in the recruiting dead period, so it's nice. It was nice to kind of have a little bit of reset and not have to do a whole lot of work. But boy, that came back in a big way on Monday. When Tennessee, it seemed like for about 3-4 hours there, news was coming out nonstop about Tennessee and the coaching staff changes. I was originally planning that morning to just do an article about the interview that Jason Swain did with former Tennessee assistant coach David Johnson, and we won't be able to really talk about that in this podcast because we have so much more to talk about. But if you haven't checked that out, check out Swain's interview with him on his podcast on the Swain Event app, or I think you can find him on SoundCloud as well. I also wrote an article from that interview with some of the most notable quotes from David Johnson, trying to explain his comments he made at a Florida State function over the weekend. But Ben, that was my original plan, was to kind of edit something you'd done for a baseball preview, to get that done, and then kind of, I wouldn't say take it easy the rest of the day, but kind of just kind of go with the flow the rest of the day. But then suddenly around, I don't know, about 8:45 or so, 8:45 or so, had the news break that Drew Hughes, Tennessee's director of player development, will be moving on to South Carolina. Shortly after that, news broke that Tracy Rocker, Tennessee's defensive line coach, will also be going to South Carolina and joining Will Muschamp's staff. Not long after that, kind of almost simultaneously, kind of around the same exact time, the news has been reported that, Bruce Philbin, I believe, is where I first saw this one, that Pruitt had already found his defensive line replacement in Jimmy Brumbaugh, who coached over at Colorado, who's coached at Kentucky, who he's got a strong track record at a lot of different places. And then around that same time, it was reported Chris Rumpf, Tennessee's outside linebackers coach, will be moving on and taking a job in the NFL with the Houston Texans. And then about an hour or so after that one, that news broke, you had the news that looked like Pruitt has found that replacement too, and hired a former Tennessee staffer in Shelton Felton, who, that's one of the best names I've ever heard in the coaching profession. He had an off-field role at Tennessee in 2018. He left to go take an on-field role at Akron, and now looks like he will be coming back to Tennessee. He also used to coach at UTC. He was the head coach at Crisp County High School, and he also was a coach at Colquitt County under Rush Probst. So then it was a very busy Monday. Last time you and I did a podcast, we talked about the hiring of Jay Graham and the movement of Brian Niedermeyer and Joe Osavette, kind of moving them around on the staff. We thought at the time there might be another move or two, but this all just happened all at once. It felt a lot like the Black Monday you have after the regular season of the NFL is over. Except I wouldn't say these guys are getting fired. I think both Tracy Rocker and Rumpf are mutual agreements for Tennessee and those two guys. I was most surprised about Drew Hughes. And before we get to our thoughts on the new hires, what did you make of the decisions of all these guys to move on? Because I think it makes sense. I think both Rocker and Rump proved to be, especially Rocker, proved to be pretty good on-field coaches. I think what the work Rocker did with the defensive line the last 2 years has been very impressive. But I think these moves were made for recruiting. I also think Rumpf was being overpaid for what he was doing. Yes, he had that co-defensive coordinator title, but he was making $800,000. I think he was being overpaid. Rocker, I think, around 500-something thousand, I think was what he was making. So, I guess not really overpaid necessarily, but that's freeing up over $1 million right there. And you go out and you get two younger guys who aren't going to command that salary. So, I'm curious your thoughts on the departures of Rocker and Rumpf, and I'm kind of surprised at the departure of Drew Hughes.
Yeah, I am too. Tracy Rocker and Chris Rumpf, that move has been in the works for months now, and that's why there was a replacement ready to announce within an hour of the news breaking that they were taking a job elsewhere. That's why there was an announcement, news breaking of who their replacement was going to be. So Chris Rumpf, Tracy Rocker, those two moves aren't surprising. Those moves have been, again, in the works for months now. I'm middle of the season is when it was maybe not set in stone, but it was definitely trending that way. And then when the regular season came to an end, it was definitely going to happen. Chris Rumpf interviewed for several NFL, not head coaching jobs, but coaching jobs. Interviewed with Kevin Shearer in New York for the Giants, outside linebackers coach, and Joe Judge, who takes over as the Giants head coach. Kevin Shearer got the inside linebackers coach job, and Chris Rumpf flew up with Kevin Shearer and interviewed for the outside linebackers coach job. So that wasn't surprising. Neither was Tracy Rocker. The only thing that was a little bit surprising about Tracy Rocker is that he is going to South Carolina. There were talks last week about him moving to an off-the-field role, but I guess he wasn't ready or didn't want to move to an off-the-field role, and that is why he is going to be coaching the same position that he was at Tennessee at South Carolina. So, again, I keep saying that those two moves are not surprising. The one that is surprising, as you mentioned, is Drew Hughes. That came out of nowhere, and that is a move that Tennessee did not want to happen. Coach Fulmer, Coach Pruitt, they definitely wanted Drew Hughes back, and at the end of the day, it was just kind of an offer that Drew Hughes could not turn down. And it's a big loss for Tennessee because he was instrumental behind the scenes in putting together this past recruiting class that should prove to be a really good one for Tennessee. And even more importantly, he was instrumental in repairing relationships in Memphis behind the scenes, taking his own time, own money, and driving across the state to Memphis to meet with high school coaches and influential people there in Memphis to repair those relationships, and meeting with former players that are well known from the Memphis area and helping get the boat going in the right direction and towards of creating a pipeline from Memphis to Tennessee. And you started to see it pay off this year with Omari Thomas, Jabari Small, the Whitehaven trio of Tamarion McDonald, Martavius French, Bryson Eason. So Drew Hughes is a big loss, and that is the one that comes out of left field. And Tracy Rocker was a great on-the-field coach. Chris Rumpf was a good on-the-field coach. So the players loved both of them. Their position units developed as much as any position on the field from the season opener to the season finale each of the last two seasons. So on the field, they are both big losses for Tennessee, but I think the trend for Jeremy Pruitt was to find coaches that were hungrier this offseason, and he found that in Jimmy Brumbaugh and Shelton Felton.
I think if you look at the last two recruiting cycles for Tennessee, and you know the discussion of I think they both have done really good job. Both recruiting classes have been good for Tennessee. But you look at the positions where we've talked about they may have swung and missed or struck out on. In 2019, it was getting that premier edge rusher, whether it would be a defensive end or an outside linebacker. That falls squarely. I wouldn't say squarely, but that falls, obviously you look at position coaches, that falls on Tracy Rocker and Chris Rumpf. And you also, I think there's been discussion of both cycles. You obviously still have a chance of getting Zach Evans, but not landing a premier running back talent. I think Eric Gray, obviously, I think he's a very, very good prospect, and he could turn out to be an elite running back. But, Tennessee was in on other higher-rated running backs in that 2019 class, and they missed out on them. And I think this offseason, or this current recruiting cycle, you saw Tennessee kind of go after some higher-rated running backs. Getting Leith Whitehead's a big get. I think T. Hodge is going to be better than what his ranking would suggest. But again, and Jabari Small is another option there too, but he's another option I would be interested to see if he maybe plays more of a slot role as a receiver. But again, you went after some, there wasn't as many big running backs in this class, but you were still going after some of the top guys in this class. And like I said, they still have a chance to get Zach Evans. But I think you look at that, you look at who they struck out on the defensive line and as a pass rusher. In this class, they had B.J. Ojulari committed. He decommitted, went to LSU. Jay Hardy situation, that was one where he was on record saying that he didn't have the greatest relationship with Tracy Rocker. You look at, Tennessee did get Amari Thomas, did get Dominic Bailey. I don't really know how much you credit Rocker with either of those two, especially with Amari Thomas. That was a lot more of, David Johnson, and I think Derek Ainsley had a lot more to do with that one too. So I think you're seeing this offseason Tennessee, running back, defensive line, and pass rusher have kind of been the three areas I think most consistently that fans and media alike have felt like Tennessee's missed out on over the last two recruiting cycles, and I think it made sense. You look at what Pruitt has done this offseason. I think he got to upgrade on the recruiting front and as a coach as well with Jay Graham. I think David Johnson is a good coach, and I like him a lot, but I think the world of Jay Graham. I think he is one of the best running backs coaches around, not just in the SEC, but all of college football. So I think that was obviously a home run hire. I've said as much on the last podcast, and I said as much on an article as well on the site. I think moving on from Rocker and Rumpf makes sense too, because as we both have said, good on-field coaches, recruiting results, it just doesn't add up to what Pruitt wants, and Pruitt is going to value recruiting over everything because it's been great. The work that Rocker and Rumpf did developing some of these guys, especially Rocker, of turning, getting more out of the NFL talent that you had with Shai Tuttle and Kyle Phillips and Alexis Johnson, getting those guys to, get them on to do a productive enough of senior seasons to get Tuttle and Phillips onto the NFL rosters. And both Tuttle and Phillips had really good rookie seasons in the NFL this past year. And then what he did with this group this year, losing Emmett Gooden, who is probably the only guy people were really, kind of permanent marking in as a starter before the year, goes down in fall camp, and then you have a bunch of guys who have never made starts, who've played kind of sparingly as guys. I think your most experienced guy was Aubrey Solomon, and he wasn't even on this team last year. He played at Michigan for 2 seasons. So to take that group, and they struggled early on in the season, but as the year went on, that defensive line, I wouldn't say it became a strength of the unit. I would say Tennessee's linebackers were more of a strength than the defensive line, but they got better. I mean, it was obvious they got better. You saw Matthew Butler develop. You saw Aubrey Solomon have some good games. You saw John Mincy have some good games. I mean, those guys developed as the season went along. But if you bring it in studs, development's one thing. But if you're a good recruiter, you can go out and get the high 4-star and 5-star guys. You don't really need to develop them that much. You can teach them some things, and having X's and O's is good. But if you're an ace recruiter, it's going to take care of a lot of the problems that, being a teacher, or if you're not a great teacher, that's okay. They should know a lot of stuff, and they should be able to get by with a lot of stuff on their natural talent. And like I said, I don't know yet how good of a teacher on the field Sheldon Felton is, or Jimmy Brumbaugh, but from what I've seen of Brumbaugh's record, his track record as what he's done at the SEC, what he's done at other schools, I think that's an excellent hire for Tennessee. He helped develop Bud Dupree into a first-round draft pick. He took another guy who I'm struggling to remember his name now. He had another. Let me look it up really quickly. He had another.
Za'Darius Smith.
Yeah, Za'Darius Smith, but also there was one. He had a first-round draft pick.
Chandler Jones.
Yeah, thank you. Chandler Jones out of Syracuse, who is a number 21 overall pick for the Patriots in the 2002 NFL draft. So he's coached 2 first-round draft picks. Za'Darius Smith, who is, I think, a 4th rounder. when he was at Kentucky, this was when Kentucky was still, I think from 2013 to 2016. So that was, when they're still trying to build up a little bit under over there, and still hadn't reached to the point where they kind of got in 2017 and 18 where they were ranked and playing a lot better. He coached 4 different guys on that defensive line in his time at Kentucky in those 4 seasons to all SEC level. I mean, that's impressive. I think Brumbaugh has a really good track record. I don't know how great of a recruiter he is, but I also think just Tracy Rocker just didn't really like the recruiting process. I mean, you saw whether it was Jay Hardy or some other guys talking about, they just didn't have relationships with them, or some of the guys that you would think Tracy Rocker would have to have a strong relationship with. He didn't, or he wasn't the main guy that had on the recruit. I think Brumbaugh, at the very least, is going to be able to be an upgrade in recruiting, even if he's not, an ace, he's not a Brian Niedermeyer or something like that. I think Brumbaugh is at least going to be an upgrade over Rocker in that regard. And I think an on-field coach, he's just as good, if not even better, than Rocker. I'm curious about Shelton Felton. That one, to me, I think Pruitt brought him in because obviously he has connection with them. He's coached with them before. He was off-field analyst role as a quality control analyst in 2018. He doesn't have, aside from that, he doesn't really have any Power 5 experience, and I think he's an interesting hire. I'm hoping, for Vol fans' sake and for his sake and for Tennessee's sake, that Shelton Felton's going to be another kind of Brian Niedermeyer clone, where he's a guy that didn't have a whole lot of big-time experience as an on-field coach, because I think actually his only other 2 on-field coaching experiences were at UTC and at Akron, and it wasn't like Akron had a very good team this year. Defensively, they were actually one of the worst in all of college football this past season, but he's there for 1 season, so I mean, I don't know how much I would take away from that. But when he was at UTC, they had the number 1 defense in the FCS the year he was there, and they were, I think, like the number 25 team, or the top 25 defense, or top 25 team overall that season he was there with them. So I know that kind of speaks for itself a little bit there too. I'm curious. I think we both like the Brumbaugh hire, and I think we both can agree that one on paper looks pretty promising. I'm curious about Shelton Felton because he's a guy that obviously he worked with Pruitt before. I think he enjoyed working with Pruitt. So that I think the comfort level is one of the reasons Pruitt made that hire, and also he's younger and save some money with that as well. But he's a very curious one to me. I don't know that on paper, looking at it, how much of an upgrade he is over Chris Rumpf, but like I said, I don't know that you could really discount the comfortability and the relationship that he has with Pruitt, and Pruitt knowing him and knowing that he likes he has the same work ethic that he wants his coaches to have.
Yeah, only time will tell if these decisions will be the right one or be the wrong one. Mm-hmm. Jeremy Pruitt, there's been a lot of talk about Jeremy Pruitt wanting to get younger, and I think he did want to get younger, but that wasn't necessarily his mindset. He wanted to get hungrier. He wanted the coaching staff to get hungrier, and by wanting to get hungrier, he got younger. I think if there was a 50-year-old coach out there that he felt like was hungry to prove a point, to prove himself, then he would have hired that 50-year-old. He didn't hire young coaches just to hire young coaches and for the average age of the coaching staff to go down. It was more about wanting to hire coaches who were hungry to prove that they could make it. Tracy Rocker and Chris Rumpf are 2 of the best assistant coaches to step foot in the SEC. They have been tremendous at developing young men over the course of their career at multiple stops. Rocker has been tremendous at developing defensive linemen. Rumpf has been tremendous at developing multiple positions on the defensive side of the ball. So they've paid their dues in a way. So that is why you see Shelton Felton getting a chance and Jimmy Brumbaugh getting a chance, because they haven't had the Tennessee type job yet, where Rumpf and Rocker, they've been throughout the SEC, especially Rocker. He's been practically everywhere: Auburn, Georgia, Tennessee, now South Carolina. So whereas Shelton Felton, he's been at Akron and UTC as a legitimate position coach, and then Jimmy Brumbaugh, he's been in the SEC at Kentucky, technically he was at LSU, but while he was at LSU from 06 to 07, he was kind of working as a strength staff member.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of being a position coach, he hasn't coached at a program like Tennessee. And Matt Jones can say whatever he wants about Tennessee, but Tennessee is a championship level program when everybody is pulling in the right direction, when Tennessee is doing what it is supposed to be doing. There's just a different type of pressure at Tennessee than there is at Kentucky or Colorado or Syracuse, Jacksonville State as the strength and conditioning coach at LSU. It's just different. We all know that than at East Mississippi Community College. It is simply different, and he understands that. I mean, he was born in Gainesville. He understands the thought process from fans and the expectations from fans at
he was a high
major
level
program.
He was a high level player for Auburn. He was a guy that was a first team All SEC selection. I think his sophomore or junior year as a lineman at Auburn in the late 90s.
Exactly. So Tennessee is in the same conversation in terms of level of program as Alabama, as Auburn, as Florida, as Georgia, LSU, in terms of expectations. And he hasn't had the chance to prove himself as a legitimate position coach at a school like that, and now he gets the opportunity to do so. I guarantee you he will be hungry to prove himself, and nobody has a greater opportunity to prove themselves than Shelton Felton, coming from Akron to Tennessee, with really no prior background of being a high-level assistant coach. I mean, that talk about needing to be hungry and wanting to be hungry to prove something. I mean, that is the prototypical started from the bottom, now we're here type situation. So I like that about these two hires, and I think Pruitt did a good job of addressing the hungriness aspect of the coaching staff, because as good as Tracy Rocker and Chris Rumpf were on the field, they still left a lot to be desired. And look, I get it. The grind of being a coach at this level would wear on me as well. I don't know how I would do it. I would prefer to be in the NFL, to where, simply put, you just have more free time to spend with your family, and it's not as stressful. So we'll see how it plays out. I am interested to see 2 to 3 years from now, when we look back, and whether we view this as a good hire or a bad hire. Because I tell you, if South Carolina or any other SEC program that Tennessee competes with, if they were hiring an outside linebackers coach from Akron, who had only previously been at UTC as a legitimate position coach, we would be laughing at them, quite frankly. So just because Tennessee made the hire and it feels like a good hire, and there are positives to take away from it, it doesn't mean that he is going to be successful. None of us know whether Brumbaugh or Shelton Felton is going to be successful. Like when Jim Chaney took the job, we knew he was going to be successful. When Derek Ansley took the job, we knew he was going to be successful. Same with T. Martin and other coaches. But with Jimmy Brumbaugh, we have a good idea that he's going to be successful. And with Shelton Felton, we honestly have no idea. But you get why Pruitt made the hire, and you can see why it can be successful. But only time will tell whether it proves to be successful or not.
Really quickly here, kind of a last football note before we move on to a brief basketball discussion here too. For Drew Hughes, what he's moving on, for, like I said, the director of player personnel. Is it as simple as promoting Danny Stiff, who is the assistant director of player personnel, to his spot and looking for, maybe to replace someone like Danny Stiff? You also have the chance of, I don't know what the differences are in the jobs, but Bethany Gunn is on staff as the director of football recruiting, and the player personnel is a big recruiting thing. In your mind, Ben, is it as simple as just promoting Danny Stiff to Drew Hughes' spot and then looking for someone to replace Danny, or do you think this is a case where Pruitt will go out there and scour the field, I guess, and try to find someone, or maybe ask Fulmer for some help and looking for someone like that, because that's a very, very, very important position. I think it was Swain who talked about this, if I remember correctly. Is either Swain or maybe the guys on the VolQuest podcast, but I'm pretty sure it was Swain that was saying that aside from the strength conditioning coach and the two on-field coordinators, your DC and OC, the director of player personnel has kind of become that kind of fourth, kind of most important, I'd say coach, most important position on a staff because of what they do, the hours they put in of reviewing film and looking at stuff. Because Drew Hughes loved that stuff. Hughes, from everything I've ever heard about him, he loved watching film. He loved trying to find guys, and whether it was diamonds in the rough or whatever, just evaluating guys and helping Tennessee readjust their board on who they're targeting and all this different stuff. From everything I ever heard about Drew Hughes, he loved to do that stuff. He loved to evaluate talent. He loved to evaluate film. So I wonder if it makes the most sense to just promote Danny Stiff into that role and find someone to replace Stiff, or if Pruitt will look on the outside somewhere else and try to bring in somebody else to replace Drew Hughes.
I don't know that I would classify it as it's just that simple, just because Danny Stiff hasn't necessarily proven himself, but he has been right behind the scenes for Tennessee, kind of really helping Drew Hughes. And to be honest with you, Danny Stiff reminds me of Brian Niedermeyer, who has a very bright future doing what they are currently doing. It's just, when does he get his chance, and does he get that first opportunity at a place like Tennessee? That is the question. It paid off with Brian Niedermeyer, with Pruitt giving him his first on-the-field coaching position, and it benefited more with the fact that Niedermeyer recruited lights out, and now with Niedermeyer moving to the defensive side of the ball, which is really his home, and few people understand Jeremy Pruitt's defense as good as Brian Niedermeyer. Niedermeyer understands each level of Pruitt's defense, and I mean he understands it flawlessly and thoroughly, and at each level of each position, what they're trying to accomplish. And now you're going to see Niedermeyer's on-field ability match his recruiting ability, in my opinion. And maybe that's slightly too strong of a statement, just because Niedermeyer has been one of the best recruiters in the country since he arrived in Knoxville. But my point is, Niedermeyer is going to prove to be a really good on-the-field coach for Tennessee as well. But with Danny Stiff, he has that same bright future. Again, it's just a matter of, is this the right time to give him the keys to that role? Because he doesn't have the experience as the head honcho, and is a place like Tennessee the place where he deserves his first start, just because he lacks that experience. So I don't know if I would say that it's just that simple because of the lack of experience. But if I'm Pruitt, I am definitely considering it. And at a place like Tennessee, you should explore every opportunity possible just before jumping to a conclusion. Just because at Tennessee, you can go out and make a run at just about anybody in the country at any position. So I would explore all the options, look around the SEC, look around college football, try to identify some names who are doing a tremendous job at their current place, interview them, and then if you don't feel comfortable with them, then ride with Danny Stiff. I don't think that there's a bad decision Tennessee can make here.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I do think you need to explore options before, like you said, just handing the reins over to Danny Stiff. But I think that wouldn't be a bad option if you don't find someone else out there you want to hire. But we'll see what happens there. There are going to be candidates. There are a lot of. That's a role that I think a lot of people. You talk about trying to get hungrier and trying to get guys who are more hungry. That's a position where you got to be hungry. You've got to love what you do. You've got to be willing to put in, essentially working 7 days a week at that point. And Hughes, he pretty much did that. And I think it's interesting that he's moving to South Carolina even more than Rocker, because Hughes has a little, he's a young family. He's got a wife. They got a young kid. I think it's interesting that he's moving to South Carolina with, as we just talked about, that sinking ship of the Gamecocks. I don't know. That one to me was the weirdest one. I'm not saying that anything went wrong with Hughes in Tennessee or Hughes in Pruitt or anything like that, but it's just that one's the weirdest one to me. Another one I wanted to mention, Ben, that isn't even an on-field coach, but one that John Bryce, I think, was the first one to broke it. I want to say it was early last week. I'm trying to remember when it was now, but it was John Bryce who had the news. It may have been late last week, but whenever it was before we could talk about it on a podcast. But it looks like nothing's been official, and I don't know if Tennessee would officially announce it since it's an off-field position or not. But it looks like Tennessee is about to hire former Notre Dame offensive coordinator Chip Long as an off-field analyst. That is some Alabama stuff right there, Ben. That, it's talking about Alabama getting Steve Sarkisian as an off-field analyst. Butch Jones, and obviously Butch Jones is a totally different type of guy, but he was a former head coach who's now an off-field analyst who you're paying $30,000 to. Chip Long is an offensive coordinator who just got let go by Notre Dame this past year. Who, yes, Notre Dame didn't have great performances against their toughest competition, against the Power 5 teams they played essentially. But even still, he's a big RPO guy. Joe Osovet's a big RPO guy. I think Jim Chaney's is using it more now too, because that just is what college football offenses do a lot more now, is using the RPO. I think getting Chip Long, if it works through, which I think it's going to, if all that aligns and works through, I think getting Chip Long as an off-field analyst, it'll probably just be 1 year just to kind of get him to have his coaching clock reset and he can go find a job somewhere else. But I think that's huge. I think getting someone with that kind of background of being an OC at Memphis, of being an OC at Notre Dame, and putting up some pretty good numbers at both places, that's huge. I think that's only going to benefit Jim Chaney. It's only going to benefit Osovet. It's only going to benefit all the guys on the offensive side of the ball, and Jeremy Pruitt too. I think that is a big move if it works out, and it looks like it's going to.
Yeah. The thing with Chip Long is that he wasn't necessarily the easiest to work with at Notre Dame, which is why he is no longer at Notre Dame. He was tremendous as an offensive mind. He kind of fits that Matt Canada situation, to where Matt Canada was hard to deal with. He could not find a job, and now he actually ended up with my Pittsburgh Steelers as the quarterbacks coach, but Long was unable to find a coordinator job, it appears, because of some rumblings of him being difficult to work with there at Notre Dame. So he's a bright mind, and it's a nice pickup for Tennessee, because even though he may have been hard to get along with at Notre Dame, he won't have a ton of say in Knoxville because he's in an off-the-field role. So even if he steps out of line, he'll be checked fairly quickly. But it never hurts to have as many bright offensive minds as possible, and there's nobody better to learn from, in my opinion, in terms of X's and O's and being a good person and just being a catalyst for a program than Jim Chaney. So Chip Long in Knoxville, it kind of feels like is what Alabama is doing with all the analyst roles, and it seems like Alabama has 15 to 20 analysts a year, and it seems like Tennessee's taking that step and going to try to do the same thing, which I don't have a problem with. If you can bring in all of the jobless, great offensive minds and defensive minds possible, then do it. As long as the rules allow for it, it doesn't hurt to bring in as many minds as possible to help the football program out.
All right, switch gears here a little bit to end this podcast. Some brief basketball talk, because this team, while they have lost against Kentucky and beaten Alabama, so they're 1-1, they do seem like they've kind of bounced back a little bit from that 3-game skid where they played really well against Kansas and just couldn't pull out the win, to a just awful loss against Texas A&M, and then another bad loss to Mississippi State on the road. Somehow come back and beat Alabama. They get a little help because the Tide just didn't play very well at all there. And then come back against Kentucky and hung tough and did some good things against Kentucky, but ultimately Kentucky's just more talented, had better size, and which is a better team. But Ben, at this point, with Tennessee being 13-10, being 5-5 in the SEC, with 9 games remaining, we're recording this before the Arkansas game, but that's going to be a tough win. Even though Arkansas is kind of reeling themselves, they've gone from 12-1 overall to 16-7. I think they've lost like 5 of their last 7 games, and they're now without Isaiah Joe, who's their second best player probably on the team, behind Mason Jones. But looking at the rest of Tennessee's schedule, the last 9 games they have left on the schedule, I'm looking at it and I see maybe 3 wins, honestly. They could beat either Arkansas or South Carolina. One of those 2 games, they could beat either one of them. They could beat both of them, possibly. I think I agree with your point on your hoops mailbag that you did, where you said if they have Josiah Jordan-James, you'd feel better about picking him to win both. But if they don't have him for both games especially, it's Tennessee's probably losing at least one of those. But they can win one of those two games against Arkansas and against the Gamecocks. They should be able to beat Vanderbilt, even though Vanderbilt is playing a little better now. That'll be in Thompson Bowling. They should win that game. And that Florida game, I think Tennessee has a good chance of winning because it's in Knoxville, and Florida has not been anywhere close to the team everyone thought they were going to be. But you have tough games against Arkansas, at South Carolina, and then you go at Auburn, at Arkansas, the back-to-back games, and then you go Florida, and then you end the season at Kentucky, and then home against Auburn. I mean, right now, Ben, I'm looking at this schedule, and I think Tennessee, I wouldn't say get lucky, but 16-16 to end the year seems, or I guess 16-15, I think what you would actually be, but barely above 500, or maybe even right below 500. It wouldn't shock me. I mean, it wouldn't shock me if Tennessee just wins 2 of their remaining 9 games. It wouldn't shock me if, I guess 2 of their remaining 8 games. I can't do math right now, but whatever it is, it wouldn't shock me if of the remaining games they have on their schedule, Tennessee only wins 2. Or it wouldn't shock me if they won, 4 and then kind of keep themselves somehow alive in that bubble. My thing with this team is I don't think they're making the NCAA tournament at this point unless they can just somehow find some kind of cohesion with this group they have and find some more consistency. Because that's been the problem is you'll see some flashes from guys, whether it's Vescovi or Pons or Fulkerson, even sometimes Bowden, and they'll flash and they'll do some things here for a bit. But the consistency with this team has just been off for pretty much all season, and it's not been all their fault. They've had a lot of times where they've had to hit the reset button on the season for this team too. But I look at this team and I think they're NIT bound. But even then, Ben, it's going to be kind of a tougher uphill battle to get to the NIT with the way they're ending their schedule and then who they get matched up with likely in the SEC tournament too.
Yeah, this team just lacks talent, especially with. Or let me rephrase that. This team has talent. It lacks experienced talent. I wrote this in my mailbag, my notebook, my hoops notebook that I've started doing each week. That this team reminds me of the team that Barnes had in his second season when he had freshman Grant Williams and freshman Jordan Bone and freshman Jordan Bowden, freshman John Fulkerson, sophomore Admiral Schofield, sophomore Kyle Alexander. That's what this team feels like to me, because that team, you saw the potential. You saw in each of those players what they can be, and with this team, I think you have players that fit the similar role. And I'm not saying that any of Tennessee's players is going to go on to be the 2-time SEC Player of the Year or be first-round draft picks like Grant Williams was, or second-round draft picks like Admiral Schofield and Jordan Bone were, but Josiah Jordan James is going to be a draft pick at some point. He'll be back at Tennessee next year, in my opinion, and I could see him making a jump similar to Kyra Lewis, who is the point guard at Alabama. Kyra Lewis had an up-and-down freshman season when you consider what his expectations were coming in to the season as a former 5-star point guard. Josiah has had a good freshman year. It just hasn't been 5-star guard worthy type of season. But that doesn't mean that he hasn't been good this year. He has been good this year, defensively, rebounding the basketball. He's not the greatest shooter, but he's a fairly efficient shooter. He can get to the basket. He's very athletic. He's long, and he works hard. His teammates really like him, and he has a good basketball IQ. He passes the ball well. Josiah is going to be an NBA player. It's just that process is going to be a little slower than we anticipated. So I see Kyra Lewis have those same freshman struggles last year, and then he lights the world on fire this year as a sophomore. I see Josiah Jordan James maybe doing the same thing once he gets an entire offseason under his belt, gets over this hip and groin injury that is bothering him. I really think Josiah is going to take a huge step forward next year, and that is what you saw in Jordan Bone when he was a freshman. Except you see even more talent in Josiah, and you look at Drew Pember and Devontae Gaines. They're not good players yet, but you see why they can be good players in the future for Tennessee, kind of like what Kyle Alexander and Admiral Schofield developed into. You look at Olivier Camois and Again, not saying he's going to be Grant Williams, because he's not going to be Grant Williams, but he can be a good player, a good starting forward at the 4 position for Tennessee if he can just get it together mentally. Rick Barnes publicly on multiple occasions at the beginning of the season compared Olivier Camois to Grant Williams in terms of when they both stepped foot on campus. And Urosh, I know Urosh has a ways to go, but I still think Urosh is going to be a good basketball player for Tennessee. He's just a freshman, and like Barnes said the other day, he's dealing with the same issues that Kyle Alexander dealt with when Kyle was a freshman, and he's further along than when Kyle was. So that's why this team reminds me of Barnes' second-year team that had all those young players, and you saw the potential in that team. They just needed time to grow, and so that's what this team needs. They're going to be a good team in the future. I think as early as next year, because you'll have a senior John Fulkerson, you'll have a senior Yves Pons, assuming he doesn't leave for the NBA a year early, which I do think is a possibility, just for the simple fact I think that he is a second-round draft pick whenever he decides to come out of Tennessee. So you'll have Pons, you'll have Fulkerson, you'll have Josiah Jordan-James, who I think is going to take a big step forward. Drew Pember, Devontae Gaines, Olivier Camois, Urosh Plavsic, they should all take a step forward as well. And then you see they're bringing in Jaden Springer, Keon Johnson. Those two have the ability to make an immediate impact. And I haven't even talked about Santiago Vescovi, and he might prove to be the best out of all of them. He's by far the best shooter out of all of them. So when I say that this team doesn't have talent, I say this team doesn't have talent that is ready to make the NCAA tournament. It will be, but this year, as much as we hate to admit it, is a transition year. So I'm with you, Nathaniel. This team isn't going to make the NCAA tournament. They'll probably lose a game, win a game, lose a game, win a game the rest of the way. Or honestly, they may go below 500 the rest of the way, just because you look at the schedule. They still have to go to Rupp Arena. They play Arkansas twice, which Arkansas is a talented basketball team. They play Auburn twice. Vanderbilt comes here, and Vanderbilt found a way to beat LSU. So all I'm going to say is anything can happen. Anything is possible. But this team, to me, I think will sneak into the NIT, and then it will take a big step forward. I compared Josiah Jordan-James to Kyra Lewis and the big step that he took this year, and I think Josiah will follow on that same path. As a team, I look at what West Virginia did last year as a transition year from Javon Carter to the team that they have this year, and I think Tennessee will do the same thing. West Virginia came to Thompson-Boling last year, and they were pitiful. They were not good at all last season after I believe they made the Sweet 16 the year before, and now they're poised to make another strong NCAA tournament run. They're a top 15, top 20 team without a doubt. I think Tennessee could make that same jump next year with its current players.
I don't think that's far-fetched at all, because look at Tennessee will be returning as experience from this year's team, and then you look at who they're adding with the 5 stars and 4 stars they're bringing in, and there's also a chance maybe you bring in a grad transfer or someone else like that as well. Next year's team is going to be a lot of fun to watch, and it'll make watching this team all the more worth it. And I think you comparing it to that 2016-17 team is interesting. You look at who kind of the leaders were, the older guys were on that team. You had Robert Hubbs as a senior, who I think with the way Bowden's playing this year, that's kind of a comparable player. Bowden is a senior. Hubbs did that season averaged 13.7 points, 4.6 boards, 1.7 assists. Bowden's line this year is fairly similar to that, honestly. And Bowden hasn't been hitting his three-pointers, and Hubbs at that point wasn't a three-point shooter either. You had him as a senior, which he was the lone scholarship senior who had been here the whole time, because you also had Lute Evans as a transfer in as a senior. And then the only other guy who was not a sophomore or a freshman on scholarship was Dietrich Mostella, and he got kicked off the team that year. So you had 2 seniors and a junior, and one of those guys, Mostella, ended up being booted off the team after 15 games? Yeah, he played 15 games that season. So halfway through the year, he gets kicked off. So you had Hubbs and you had Lou Evans as your only 2 older guys on the team. Everyone else, freshmen or sophomores, as you mentioned, Grant Williams, Lamonte Turner, Jordan Bowden. Those guys were all freshmen. Jordan Bone, freshman. John Fulkerson, he got hurt, also a freshman. Sophomore, you had Admiral Schofield, Shambari Phillips, who ended up not sticking with the team. and Kyle Alexander. You also had Quay Parker as a freshman. He also ended up not sticking with the team. I forgot how young that team was. I mean, that was an extremely young team in Barnes' second season. This year, I mean, it's pretty similar. Bowden, like I said, he's got that comparable role to Hubbs. He's averaging 13.1 points, 4 rebounds, 2.4 assists. You do have Fulkerson and Pons as older guys, as two juniors, but Lamonte Turner was an older guy. He's no longer on the team because he's having that season-ending injury, or season-ending shoulder surgery. Jalen Johnson's kind of developed into your sixth man as a junior. But those are, I mean, you have a little bit more kind of senior, older leadership in this team. You did that 2016-17 team. You're not relying on as many freshmen and sophomores, but you're still having a freshman in Josiah Jordan-James who is starting for you all the games he'd played until he got hurt, and now you replaced him with a redshirt freshman who, I mean, he didn't play any as a freshman at Arizona State, and so he's essentially a freshman for you right now. And you have everyone else besides Jalen Johnson on the bench is a freshman. I mean, you don't have Zach Ken anymore. He was a sophomore. He's no longer here. Every other person that is coming off the bench from Tennessee, and Santiago Vescovi, who's a true freshman, is starting for you right now, too. So that's two freshmen, whether it's Plauschvik or James, that are starting for you as freshmen. And then every bench person that you're relying on besides Jalen Johnson is a freshman. I mean, there is no sophomore class for this team right now. You have senior, 3 juniors, and then just a bunch of freshmen. So I understand people being frustrated with this team. I understand people kind of, being upset with what we've seen so far this year. But like you said, it's a team that's in a transition. It's a team that they're taking their lumps now. But I am genuinely very, very excited for next year's team. And it sucks having to say next year, but Vol fans should be used to that, I guess. But in basketball, that's not been the case. We've seen Tennessee do really well in basketball. I also think this year, you look back the last 2 seasons for Tennessee, except for that Kyle Alexander injury in the NCAA tournament in 2018 when he got hurt, and it kind of cost Tennessee a little bit playing Loyola Chicago in the second round because of the way they were able to get screens and do stuff in the cutting into the rim and everything like that. That really did affect Tennessee. Aside from that one injury, Tennessee over the last 2 seasons had gotten extremely lucky with injuries and roster attrition, to where they had minimal injuries and attrition for their teams, especially for their star players and stuff. They're getting paid back for that quite a bit this year with Lamonte Turner going down. Now Josiah Jordan-James has been out at a pivotal stretch. Urosh didn't get cleared for the first half of the season. You had to welcome in a freshman point guard who you're having to start because of the fact that Lamonte Turner is no longer on the team. And it obviously lost 4 guys to the NBA this past offseason as well. So this team, to me, is... I think just having to pay for the fact that Tennessee had such good luck over the last 2 years too, and that's not to say that they're unlucky or whatever. It just I found it interesting thinking about it earlier today that Tennessee didn't really have that many injuries and that much attrition over the last 2 seasons. Barnes' third and fourth seasons. This year has been probably one of the most attrition-riddled teams that Barnes has had, other than maybe that second season where, like I said, Mostillo got kicked off and you had Shamari Phillips ended up eventually leaving the roster as well. So it's I think they'll make it to the NIT. They've got to be above 500 to get there. The only way, in my opinion, they make it to the NCAA tournament is if they somehow go on a big run, upset like Auburn and Kentucky, both maybe, or upset Auburn and Arkansas. They're going to have to win. They're going to have to get 2 or 3 upsets on the regular season, and then they're going to have to make a little bit of a run in the SEC tournament. The bubble's not very strong this year. That kind of helps them out a little bit, but I just haven't seen enough from this team to bank on them being an NCAA tournament team. But I definitely think they can get to the NIT. Having some postseason play for some of these guys would be nice. It would suck for Jordan Bowden for that to be the way his career ends at Tennessee, but it is what it is. But I think that's where we're kind of in this. We don't want to talk about a whole lot about the Arkansas game because by the time most of you listen to this, I assume the game will be over and everything. So we didn't want to talk about that game too much. But thank you all so much for tuning into this episode of the RTI Podcast. We really appreciate you guys tuning in. If you have any comments or questions about our discussion about Tennessee's coaching staff changes, anything about basketball, let us know in the comments on the YouTube section. Let us know on Twitter, at Rocky Top Insider on Twitter. I'm at Mr._Rutherford. He is at Ben McKee14. Ben also, like he mentioned, is doing a new weekly thing now. I think it's the 3rd week we've done it, where he has a hoops mailbag/notebook where he talks about both the men's and women's basketball programs at Tennessee. He asks for questions usually every Monday, sometimes Sunday night, but usually every Monday for you guys to ask him questions about the team, and you all give some pretty good questions and ask some good stuff there. And he kind of gives a recap of the last week, looking ahead to the upcoming week, and answers your all's questions. So be sure to look for that on the site. Probably every Tuesday is when that's coming out, unless there's a game on Wednesday or something like that. We'll maybe adjust schedules and stuff too, depending on when the Vols and Lady Vols play. But that's a new thing I'm excited about that Ben does a great job doing every week now. It is called Notes from the Summit, which I think is a very good title for the notebook. So check that out on RockyTopInsider.com. Notes from the Summit, to get your weekly dose of everything happening with Tennessee men's and women's basketball. But thank you all for tuning in to this episode. Signing off for Ben, I'm Nathaniel. And until next time, this has been another episode of the RTI Podcast.